Okay. We're going to get started. You all can keep eating, and the panelists can keep eating. But I just want to introduce the panelists before they are each going to speak for a few minutes, and then we're going to just open it up for a question and answer. And they really are interested in having this be discussion-oriented, so please be thinking of comments and questions, and at the same time I'm going to ask that when we do that, that you limit yourself to brief comments or brief questions. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in the order in which they will be speaking tonight. So born and raised on Kauai's North Shore in Kalihiwai, Kapua Sprott, is a member of the Akana and Sprott Ohana of Kauai and Kohala, Hawaii. She joined the law school in 2007 as an assistant professor with Kahuli'au Center for Excellence in Native Hawaiian Law. She teaches courses in Native Hawaiian and environmental law and legal research and writing. And she just received a service award, and I think she's probably one of the younger people to receive that award. Her areas of scholarship and interest include Native Hawaiian law, indigenous rights, and natural resource protection and management. And prior to joining the UH faculty, she spent 9 years as an attorney in the Hawaii Office of Earth Justice, a national public interest environmental litigation firm. And she worked to preserve the resources necessary to support Native Hawaiians and perpetuate Kanaka Maoli culture by litigating a number of state and federal cases. She remains as counsel at Earth Justice, where she continues to work on water and other issues. S. Shankar, to her left, will speak next. He's a professor in the UH English department, born in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. He's lived in the U.S. since 1987. His interest in the play we just saw, and if you came in late, you might not know that that was his translation that we were watching, that the Madras players used. His interest in the play we just saw, he describes as a Marxist critique of top-down post-colonial developmentalism. And this interest permeates his work not only as a translator, but also as a teacher, novelist, critic, and his latest critical book, Flesh and Fish Blood, Post-Colonialism Translation in the Vernacular, won a very impressive award. He's also a cultural journalist for publications including The Hindu. In addition to his opposition to caste and class-based injustices, his commitments to a materialist critical practice and to comparativism characterize his various writings, as well as his efforts in organizing events such as so Charlie Raccoon will be next after Shankar. Charlie farms with his brother Paul, where's Paul? Here. We're hoping we'll hear from Paul tonight as well. He farms with Paul in Waihole and Waihe'e on the windward side of Oahu. Kalo is their main crop. Charlie, Paul, and their brother John and other family and many community members have been at the forefront of water struggles since 1974, when Charlie and Paul started growing kalo in Waihe'e Valley and found that the Honolulu Board of Water Supply was diverting most of the stream. This water fight, Raccoon versus DWS, helped spur the 1978 Constitutional Convention to pass amendments that created the legal framework for the creation of a water code, with water as a public trust managed by the state. When the water code was finally adopted in 1987, the stage was set for a community petition to the Water Commission to restore water to the Waihole stream. With the essential help of Earth Justice, and a huge community effort, water diverted for sugar 60 plus years was restored to several windward streams. So it's really great to have you here tonight. Keith Feinoff will speak last. And those of you here tonight, even if you are not already acquainted with his work as a journalist, will know he is one of the most respected and influential journalists we have working today. It's not often you get to say something like that and have it actually be true. Noted for having impacted public policy, he has transformed reporting on the agrarian crisis in India through his coverage of farmer suicides and his analyses of neoliberal policies. From reading his remarkable book, Everybody Loves a Good Drought, which has just become a Penguin classic and I think is in its 40th edition. Yes. And from watching videos about him and his work, and I really highly recommend Nero's guests, if any of you haven't seen that on YouTube, it's amazing. And from talking with him these past few days, I can tell you that he is a very dangerous man for anyone invested in protecting corporate crime. With imaginative empathy, a poet's eye, and a fierce intelligence, he documents the everyday and extraordinary lives of millions of farmers and impoverished laborers fighting for survival in the face of corporate greed, governmental collusion, and societal indifference. I particularly appreciate how the depth of his compassion for the people who share their stories with him is matched by his deep and precisely directed rage at the sources of injustice that make their lives literally unlivable. I also appreciate his clear and passionate insistence that his audiences, including in order to maintain our own humanity, refuse complicity with the nameable and knowable wrongs that he documents. So it's a great honor to be introducing this panel to you. And I now turn things over to our panelists. So, Kapua.
Aloha mai kākou. And mahalo for the great privilege of being here this evening, especially with such a distinguished panel. I'd like to thank Sydney for organizing this forum, and to Shankar for translating the play, and really to Sayan for coming all the way here from India to share his mana'o, and of course Uncle Charlie for coming all the way from Waiahole. It's not often that he'll make that cross, across the Ko'olau Mountains, so we're very lucky this evening. Tonight I'll be sharing my mana'o as a Kanaka Maoli, as a community member, as a community organizer, and also as an attorney and as a professor. And I was chatting with Uncle Charlie earlier, and in the spirit of the play, as far as organizing and reorganizing and civic engagement, we thought it would be fun to sort of, I'm going to try to keep my comments short at the outset because I think it would be much more fun to be able to engage with each of you and each other. But to provide some context on where I'm coming from, for me, the similarities between the politics of water in India and in Hawaii are stark and disappointing. I think on a very positive note for us here in Hawaii, because as Sydney mentioned, because of the hard work of folks like the Rafoons and the Hos, people in this room and beyond, we're fortunate to have some opportunities for justice through law. And as the Constitutional Convention that Sydney mentioned made really strong provisions for the public trust, which makes clear that here in Hawaii, water isn't a commodity that can be owned by any individual or corporation. Instead, it's a resource that's supposed to be proactively managed by the Commission on Water Resource Management for the benefit of present and future generations. So all of us here have a stake in our water future. And thanks to the hard work of a lot of people, we also have very clear tools that enable us to help bring that to life. But unfortunately, although we have incredible laws on the books, or incredible black letter laws, some people would explain it, on the ground, in the community, things are not much different than we saw in the play this evening. I mean, unfortunately, the majority of the water is still held by a handful of corporations, really, and it's been incumbent upon people like Uncle Charlie and many others to be able to really bring the law to life on the ground and in the community. And so I guess the positive aspect is that we have opportunities. The negative things is that that's taken a tremendous amount of work and commitment on behalf of a handful of people, and it's really become a legacy that they've passed on to their children. So with that, I will turn things over. Mahalo.
Thank you. And for me too, it's a real privilege to be on this panel with all my fellow panelists. Maybe I'll just take a little bit of the time that I have to remind people, to let people know who came in late, that there are 3 more events, tomorrow, day after, and on Friday. And I don't want to go over all the details, but 12 noon in the Center for Hawaiian Knowledges is a panel. 6 reception, 7 o'clock on Thursday is public lecture by P. Sainath. And on Friday at 2:30 in political science is, again, a talk by him on the media. And so let me just say that as a way of reminder for those who may not have. So it's a full slate of events. I'm going to talk mostly about the play and my experience of translating it and why I think it remains so relevant today. And it might seem as if, like, why am I even pointing out its relevance? Because before I actually found a publisher for this play, it's published by Seagull Theatre, Seagull Publishers in Kolkata. I actually sent it to a few publishers in Delhi who will remain unnamed. But they promptly wrote back to me and said, this is maybe about 10 years ago, 2003. So they promptly wrote back to me and said, this is so dated, this is such a Marxist play, So why should we publish this? And so they actually turned the play down, And I went to Seagull, and Seagull has a very distinguished theater publishing list, and I was very pleased that they published it. So for me, of course, when I translated it, it didn't seem dated at all. It seemed to me like it was ripped from the headlines that Sainath was writing, So, and it remains to me 10 years after I translated it, still relevant, right? It seemed to me so contemporary and so relevant, and it really has resonated with people, audiences. I can say that I wasn't at the performance that was, at the end of 2012, when the English translation was performed by Madras Players. I couldn't go, but the reports that I got from my friends and my family who attended was that there was amazing response. It was houseful, as we say in India, and they're going to revive this performance again. They have some plans to kind of adapt the play, not necessarily translate it, but adapt the story in other languages in India, which I think is fantastic, and I think Koma Swaminathan would have loved it. So I really want to dwell on the relevance of that. I mean, the sort of not only in India, relevance not just today in India, but possibly, across the world, as Kapoor was pointing out as well. And maybe I'll just say two other things, because I too am interested in having a conversation rather than saying a whole bunch of, and here I'm going to steal some of Charlie's thunder because we were talking on Sunday, and he was telling me that, he thought the female character, Seventhi, was one of the most amazing characters in the play. And I said, absolutely. And I'm not sure it came through in the play what a radical act that was for her to take off her thali. And in the Tamil original, I think it's much more emphatic. She actually pulls it off, which is what I would say, but and throw it and say, I reject this. In 1980, I think that is in that context, it's a really feminist kind of like an act to do, where she really sort of understands the nature of the social structure and acts against it. So that's one thing which I've always appreciated about the play. It really is sort of lots of male characters, but there is this really important female character who's central to the action of the play. The second thing is the dignity of the poor. And here again, I want to sort of, Sainath's work too reminds me of this. It's not just poor as victims, as obstructions, but there's a dignity to them. And I think Koma Swaminathan in the play really respects that, and it really respects the dignity of the poor. So these are the two things that really sort of struck me ever since I was a college student in Chennai when the play was, the Tamil Koma Swaminathan play was all the rage. And it really was a phenomenon. It was a national phenomenon because there was an attempt to ban it and to not have it be on the stage, and also because of all the other things that I mentioned when I introduced the play. So I think I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more I can say, but I just maybe goes to the dignity of the poor and the sort of the importance of recognizing the role of the female character.
I too would like to thank the organizers of all this event, and thank you very much for the fantastic food. It's really great. It's interesting for me to be sitting on a panel with somebody from the media. It just was recalling in the Waiholi water case, the instructions that we were given. Whenever you deal with the media, you listen to whatever questions they ask, and then you say whatever the message is that you want to say. Forget about the questions. But I think this is a very different media person here. I guess I want to focus a little bit on we've been very successful in creating good water law in this state. But the actual implementation of it, the actual having it make a difference, that's been much more problematic. And I think the issues have gotten even more difficult since our water code was passed. I think we have some serious structural problems in the way our economy works. And so I've gotten a little bit jaded, and anyway, we can get into that as we go along. I'll stop there.
Well, I'm afraid I am going to throw a bunch of things at you. And before I start throwing a few photographs at you, I wanted to say the region where this play is located, South Tamil Nadu. 20 years ago, I mean, I've been a journalist 33 years, but it was 20 years ago that I went to being full-time a rural reporter. And the first story was a spectacular experience with water in this region, not in Tirunelveli, but in Pudukkottai. I was on a night train which stops in the town of Pudukkottai, which is extremely water stressed, same region, at 4 a.m. Now, I was the only guy getting down at the station. Everybody else was asleep or, in the process of getting some sleep. When the doors of the train burst open inwards, threw me off balance, 30, 40 people got on, raided the train. Immediately there was panic. I mean, those who were awake panicked. Because here was a gang raid, an attack on the train, and those who were awake were hiding their wallets and their, valuables. The 30, 40 people raiding the train didn't even look at us. They were armed not with weapons but with buckets. They looted the water tanks and toilet tanks of the train, took the water and were gone in 5 minutes. Okay, that was it. That was my introduction to the South Tamil Nadu water problem. Fine. And then when I told my hosts who had come to receive me, I said, they just looted the train of water. They said, again? I said, yeah. He said, every night. He said, that's where they have to get their water from. Okay, but the water that is denied those people in the play, it goes somewhere else. And I think we need to look at that. Just, Steve, can you just go back to I want to explain go back to the first. In the water-stressed state of Maharashtra, which had a major drought this year, you're looking at building after building coming up. This is 37 stories with a swimming pool on every floor. A swimming pool on each and every floor in the drought areas. Now these floors, each floor is one luxury apartment of 6,000 to 9,000 feet. Notice that the swimming pool is an extended balcony. Okay, so it's an architectural marvel. Can you go to the next pic? Thanks, Stephen. Both these towers, there is a swimming pool on every floor like that. You know the kind of water it takes? Next, please. Yeah. Now this is one more construction. You can look at the blue you see. Those are the swimming pools on every floor. Next. Go further. Yeah, next one. Oh, look at this. This is on the highway into the drought area. Luxury homes with an attached forest reserve. Even the damn tiger in the Maharashtra state does not have a forest reserve for it. And this is a complex with 23 villas, each of which has a swimming pool of 1,000 square feet. And now, as you drive past and into the drought areas, you look at a very different reality. This is the advance booking for water in the morning, and in the afternoon, 3 times the water will come for about an hour. So the women have kept their pots and jerry cans lined up in order of priority. So if I came first, my can is first. And this is not very far from the luxury villa with forest reserve attached. Okay? Yeah, go on. Now these women, this is the 6th stop they are making that day, where they've gone to get as many liters of water as they can, because in that whole area, Osmanabad, from Pune and Baramati downwards, Osmanabad, that is from western Maharashtra to Marathwada, every family rotates within itself, that one member of the family will spend one day of the week not going to work but just collecting water. So the women, of course, they do it 7 days of the week. But move on and you'll see that the men are also doing it. Yes, Stephen? Oh, that's the last one? Okay, you'll see every vehicle, every scooter, every motorcycle with 6, 10 jerry cans going on as guys go out to get water for the day and rotate that within the family as an operation. But I think it's very important for us to understand that this swimming pool on every floor, even what water we do have, how do we use it? There are great class inequalities in this. And a new planet is emerging within our societies. A tiny, gilded, golden, global ghetto. In India, in half a dozen cities and a few districts. So I'm saying that I want to place the water resource crisis in the context of growing inequality. Whatever water there is, the poor are getting less and less, and the corporations and the super rich are getting more and more. The second, and this is what I would like to pose to you as 2 questions. And I'm insisting that nothing we do has any value unless we are able to answer for ourselves this question. Is water a commodity or a human right? Our answer to that question will determine what our action and response will be. I don't think it's just a human right, by the way, because we share the planet with millions of other species that also depend on water. Okay? But is it a living right? I think it is. If you see it as a commodity, then none of this is wrong. If it's a commodity, if it is to be privatized as it is being, so is it right to make a profit out of a life-giving substance like water? Question. Is it a human right or a commodity? Question. The second point is, you should know that water is the last great natural resource that has not yet been substantially privatized. Only about 10% of the water in the world, and by the way, there isn't that much water in the world. You know, we call Earth a water planet, but 97.5% of the Earth's water is in the seas and the oceans, salt water. Of the remaining 2.5%, all but 0.8%, of the remaining 2.5%, 2/3 is in the glaciers and in the ice caps. So humanity is depending on 0.8% of fresh water in the world. How we use that, how we divide that up, how we share it, poses very important questions. Comes back to, is water a right or a commodity to profit from? This is linked to my view, which I will keep throwing at you, that the 2 greatest crops in the world are not wheat and rice, not even taro. The 2 greatest crops in the world are hunger and thirst, and more money is made out of those than all the other crops together. And there is no such thing as food security without water security. So the global the corporate grab for water is the determining battle of natural resources. Understand this, the difference between water corporations and all others, even those bastards we call big oil, they pay a royalty for the resource. Water corporations don't pay any royalty. They get subsidies from the state and public funds. Even the worst oil corporation has to pay some royalty for the oil it gets, but not the guys who are planning to take 6 million or 6 billion liters of your water in the project that Monsanto envisages, for instance. They're not paying royalties, they're getting money from the state to help them maximize their profit. Now, if you look how much this process is aided, the 3 top water corporations in the world, Suez, Vivendi, and RWEAG, the 3 top water corporations also figure in the list of the top 100 corporations of the world. In fact, Bechtel was also there, but has blown a gasket somewhere, I think after its fight in Cochabamba perhaps, right? So was Thames PLC there, and there was once an Anglo-Suez which isn't there, but the top water corporations are in the top corporations of the world. If humanity has to live without oil at some stage, as they will have to, they'll survive, because you lived for millennia without oil, but nobody ever lived without water. So the grab for water, that is the final frontier of corporate profit until we start getting to work on oxygen. Oh, excuse me, we made a pretty good shot at that in the Kyoto protocols with the pay and pollute principle, right? You can pay, you can have carbon credits, you can pollute more if you're willing to pay the fines. So yeah, so in a sense you are taking a shot at the privatization of oxygen, but water is more dramatic. All over the world where water supply systems have been privatized, you've had riots like in Johannesburg where they had to withdraw the water privatization. Since 1998, more than, I think, something like 40% of agreements, loan agreements of the IMF and the World Bank have made water privatization a conditionality. You want the loan, you've got to agree to opening up your water sector to privatization. I must tell you, the great Wolfenson, succeeded by the great Wolfowitz, I mean, Wolf by any name at the door, but Wolfenson came down. They saw that the public had anger over privatization of water. So they decided how they would do it. They would make it look like a community thing. They started water users associations. Okay? The rest of us are dryland bacteria. We don't need water. I mean, who the heck is a water users? Water, absolutely every species on the planet is a water user. Anyway, they decided to open a huge, in Mehboob Nagar in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana now, they decided to put a plaque on a dam they were opening up for water as the effort of the water users associations. Now Mr. Wolfenson came there. Unfortunately for him, Andhra Pradesh and the people of that state are a fairly politicized, active, aggressive, abusive. In fact, I'm one of them. So the non-water users, or the water non-users, showed up in thousands to tell Mr. Wolfenson what they thought of him, and they chased him down the highway. Then, so the convoy, the police told the World Bank president's convoy to push off because they were not able to stop the crowds. So what did they do? Now, if you see, if Muhammad couldn't go to the mountain, they had to do something to fix the mountain. So they built a helipad in the nearby periphery area of the jungle, created a wooden structure there, put a plaque on it, and Mr. Wolfenson flew in there in a helicopter and inaugurated the Water Users Association. Okay. Water is that gigantic source of revenue. With less than 10% privatized, the revenue, the turnover is in excess of somewhere between $200 and $240 billion. And that was a 2001 figure. I have no idea on the update. I should fancy that's a hell of a lot more. Now, how is it affecting farmers? How is it affecting agriculture? About 2/3 of the water we use, other than drinking, is used for agriculture. And the last 20 years are a period of gigantic diversions and transfers of water from agriculture to industry, to industrial use of water, to construction, to luxury use of water, water sports, to golf courses, which take 1.8 million liters of water a day in season, apart from all the pesticides they use. The second factor is the gigantic transfer of land use from food crop to cash crop and to water guzzling crops. In this region where this whole crisis is unfolding, in the heavy drought areas, we grow sugarcane, which takes per acre the full production process. I'm not talking about the water you put on the land, but the full production process through the mill, 18 million liters of water per acre. And in case you're not satisfied with that, we've started growing in the same area roses, which take even more. Meanwhile, a new land grab is on, speaking of natural resources, and Africa is once again the target and the victim. Indian and Chinese companies are amongst those leading the charge in Ethiopia, where we've taken thousands of acres to grow roses. Okay? Each rose takes about 5 to 6 liters of water on average. Each rose. We're doing this in Kenya, we're doing this in Ethiopia, and a hell of a lot of other things that take water. The grabbing of farmland, the grabbing of land, the grabbing of water, this is the gigantic loot and grab sortie of our time. All over, in the same region again, going back to that region, and I'll let you off the hook with that. How technologies work in a context. When in that region, in Tulakampatti and in Kovilpatti, there's another Kovilpatti in Pudukkottai, in Gandharva Kotte. Let me put it this way, community A in the village, forest farmers, Mutturajas, NBCs, that is the most backward class. They had the good land. It's a historical accident. They did some ruler a favor and they had the best land. The richer communities, the traders and the Reddiyars, had not so good land. Look how class works, how caste works. Everybody made a noise about the drought. That's why the title of my book is Everybody Loves a Good Drought. That's one of the reasons. The government decided to sink borewells and solve the problem. There is enormous drama in the sinking of a well. Who decides what kind of well? Who decides what depth to go to? Who decides on whose land the well will be put? All the wells were put on the side of the rich farmers, and those were bore wells that went down 800 feet, whereas the dug wells of the poor farmers were 30 to 50 feet, which went dry. Within 5 years of the miracle-saving technology of bore wells, all the land of the poor farmers was owned by the rich guys. Why? First, you run out of water. So I go to Charlie for water. He's the guy, because the bore wells are on his side of the village. Then, what does he do? He sells me water. The starting of a water market. In Shankar's home state, in that region, a class of people has emerged called Tanir Adhipati, the water lords. Okay? Now he starts selling me water. He's making much more money from that than from farming. Then he tells me, why am I selling? If my cycle is 45 days, he lets me have the water for 30 days and then stops. I'm on my knees begging him to release the remaining water. He says, why the heck should I release water to you? You're growing rice, I'm growing rice. You're a competitor. Grow something else. So now first, before that, he demands a share of my produce. The established share now is 1/5 of the produce. In some cases, 1/4. But the best scenario is 1/5 of your produce in order to release water to me. Then he rationalizes what I'm growing by telling me, now, if you're going to grow rice, paddy too, I'm not going to give you water. Okay? After a while, I'm in terrible debt to Charlie. He acquires my land. In Andhra Pradesh, in my home state, I was in Telangana a few days ago, and in Rayalaseema too, a region where brother is killing brother over water. And I mean own brothers. Your own brother kills you. Why? An old man died. He had 20 acres and he had 4 sons. Property only goes to the sons. So each of them, no problem. 4 guys, 20 acres, 5 acres each, no problem. No, there is a problem. Charlie and I kill each other over who gets that plot of 5 acres which has the bore well. Okay? So the despair and desperation that water crisis is driving is from global wars fought by nations over water down to brother killing brother. You're looking at the natural resource battle of your time in land and in water. But the bigger distance to go is going to be in water. So you answer your question, think about this question. Is water a human right? Is it the right of every living being, not just humans? Or is it a commodity to profit from? Thank you.
We're just going to move the tables together so that I can use this mic for people who have questions. Okay. This is being taped by Olelo, so if you're asking a question, you are agreeing to be taped by Olelo.
Can I just wanted to say something really quickly in response to Sainath, or in addition to what Sainath said. One of the things that I worked on is, in fact, Coca-Cola's sort of use of water. On Plachimada in Kerala, I wrote an essay about this.
Can't hear you.
Was Coca-Cola and water, Coca-Cola Corporation and their use of water, and especially in India, there have been a number of sites where Coca-Cola's mining of water has actually driven farmers out of business, and it's actually the same way of like extensive mining of water. I hate that term, mining of water, right? I mean, has driven sort of farmers out of being able to do. And there have been some successes in Kerala, in Plachimada, where they managed to actually close the Coca-Cola plant down. But the reason I wanted to sort of add to what Sainath was saying is that when I was doing research for that essay and I wrote about it, there were two things that I read which have always stuck in my head. One is that in northern Mexico, where also there's a water crisis, at least in the 80s and the 90s, mothers would give their babies Coca-Cola and Pepsi because there was no water which was uncontaminated. Not everywhere in northern Mexico, but in parts of, because it's the only sort of clean beverage that was available to you. So you can think of the health consequences of this. The other is when, the other story which has stuck with me is when the CEO of Coca-Cola, I think in the late 80s or the 90s, went on a tour of Africa and kept getting questions about, what does, you're here in Coca-Cola, we have lots of, you're here from Coca-Cola, we have lots of other things to worry about, And he was like, well, Coca-Cola is a good thing, Coca-Cola is hydration, we're actually doing a good thing in Africa because we are providing hydration, So this is completely absurd kind of situations which are created because of the water crisis. And, the corporate response to it is really very surreal at times, Yeah.
And just to add really briefly to what Shankar said, we're not quite at that point in Hawaii yet, but we're definitely seeing a phenomenon where many of the former plantation interests that controlled such a large percentage of the surface water systems are now spinning off LLCs or limited liability corporations and are creating water companies. For example, in Waiʻeha in central Maui, it went from Wailuku Sugar to Wailuku Agribusiness to Wailuku Water Company. And even though they've completely sold up all of their land, they retain their surface water system that takes between 60 to 70 million gallons of water each day from 4 different streams and communities, most of which were predominantly Native Hawaiian. And now that their land's been sold off, they're marketing that water to development interests in the area and the county of Maui as well. So that's certainly, a phenomenon that's happening here in Hawaii and something that we need to be cognizant of.
I just wanted to add one little fact. A can of Coca-Cola has about 200 calories, and it takes about 2,200 calories of oil to make that can of soda.
Does anybody on the panel want to respond to anybody else, or should we move to questions?
Thank you all for being here. I wonder, given the extensive world issue that we're seeing, and the idea that greed is going to be the main reason this is all happening, are there any places in the world that have intelligibly come up with ways of dealing with this that we could model here?
Yeah. Curiously enough, I mean, some of the biggest battles on this, on the water, have been fought in Latin America. And 2004, a tiny country called Uruguay gave the rest of the world a lesson. They had a referendum, amended their constitution with an overwhelming vote of their population to see that water shall never, ever be privatized in Uruguay. So, yes, that's something we can learn from.
And actually, I think here in Hawaii, we have our own model and lesson of how things can and should be done. Before the arrival of Europeans in Hawaii, water was strongly a public trust resource. It was not something that was owned or commodified. Instead, it was viewed, freshwater in particular, as a kinolao, or physical embodiment of Akua Kane, one of the four principal gods of the Hawaiian pantheon. And so because of that, and because of its spiritual significance, it could not be commodified. It was managed for the public good. And it was not until sort of the later in the kingdom period and then during the territory that water really began to be commodified. That sense has been rectified with the McBride versus Robinson case and with the Hawaii Supreme Court decisions. But I think we have a model here in Hawaii of ahupua'a-based resource management where we know how to do things correctly. We've just been off track for the last 150 years or so.
I was just going to say, even though we have the public trust doctrine here in Hawaii, what happened in the Waiahole water case is that basically it should have been an open and shut case. It should have been really easy because the water code went into effect and we applied to have water returned, and then soon after that application went into the newly formed Water Commission, the Oahu Sugar Company went out of business. So we thought this is easy, but the large landowners they wanted to hang on to this water, not because they're interested in agriculture, but in order to hang on to it, they had to have agriculture. So they started up all this agriculture, which was great, and it still should have been a really easy case because sugar uses like 5 times the water that any other crop uses. So. And a lot of their source of water for the leeward side of the island was pumped groundwater. So there should have been plenty of pumped groundwater to be able to do all the agriculture they wanted and put the water back into the stream for all the reasons that we were talking about it needing to go back into the streams, including one of the most important, which is water flowing into the ocean and estuaries and all of that kind of stuff, which nobody looks at too much. But what happened is the Water Commission basically decided that all groundwater needed to be reserved for urban use. They said that was the highest and best use of groundwater. And that's essentially what happened. So those large landowners that had wells, they just turned them over to the Board of Water Supply and said, we don't have any groundwater source. And now it's all in the hands of the Board of Water Supply, and that water has been reserved for urban use. And the problem is that basically urbanization is what drives our entire economy. When was the last time you ever heard a news report that said, new housing starts down, what great news? Never ever happens. So for the entire United States, and especially for Hawaii, urbanization is what drives the economy. And we have no idea what an economy would look like that didn't have a growing population. Well, we have a little bit of an idea because in the late 90s, population growth rate in Hawaii actually went to 0 for the first time in a long, long time. And everybody, they weren't really talking about that, but they were wringing their hands because what was happening with our economy, what were we gonna do? And what was happening was that lots and lots of people were moving to places like Las Vegas, which was growing at the rate of 50,000 people a year, because there was so much construction going on there, so much house building. Luckily, Hawaii got back on track again, and now we've got a whole bunch of projects planned for Central Oahu. And so our economy is solid again and we can keep riding that urban growth car down the road that has dead end at the end of it.
I think the only way to really fight this battle is by looking at whatever right you want to call it. Water, along with several other elements, is a right, because this basic political economic principle here is that if it is a right, then somebody has the obligation, and rights are meaningless unless they are accompanied by an obligation that somebody has to give you, what is your right. And usually the obligation is the government, is the state, right? So we need to insist on the fact that water is a right. And there may be a price for it, but we pay for it at a social level and not at an individual level. When I go to India, I sometimes, say, I feel as if, because in a middle class families, I feel as if I'm living in what I call an AquaGuard society, right? It's not just the buying of water, it's the fact that your AquaGuards are water purifiers in your home. So the water in the city is undrinkable in most ways, but you have an AquaGuard machine in your home which purifies the water and makes it drinkable. This, I think, is a real problem, because what it means is that you don't feel that sense of responsibility and obligation with other people in your community. So you get into your air-conditioned car, you go to your AquaGuard mall, you drink your AquaGuard water, and there's a way in which I think those bonds are breaking down. And the only way we can do that is by not saying I can afford to have an AquaGuard machine and so I don't care, but that the right is something that everybody in my community should have. And I should defend the right of somebody else. The slum dweller, like 5 streets away, to have that right to clean water is a right that I have to defend, even though I can afford to have an AquaGuard machine which purifies water and I don't need to care. And we need to go one step further, which is that we are not exempt. I mean, it's a single planet. It's not like, okay, it's a problem in India, it's a problem in Africa, it's a problem in Mexico, but it's a problem for us. I mean, it's a single planet with a single sort of, resource of water, and if it's a right for all human and living beings, then we have to ask the question, what is our obligation? And there will be a price, but how do we pay the price if we don't do it in a commodity way, which of course is really the wrong way to do it. The idea of defending it as a right, I think, is really crucial, because and then we have to understand that a right is accompanied by an obligation, and we need to identify who and that's what happened in Uruguay, right? Is to recognize that it's a right and that there is an obligation, and the obligation then has to be asserted. It's my right, and therefore you have the obligation to, and I think that's one way to go.
Just following up on that point, I know the UN was debating this issue. What have they resolved about water being a right or a commodity?
I don't think that they have, to the extent that I followed it, which is not very much, because even the FAO on food security nowadays has gone, completely off track. You will find, in some UN declaration, you will find recognition of water as a right. You will find that. You will also find, in many other documents, the opening up, the need for creating infrastructure, etc., which opens up large spaces for the private sector. So you'll find both positions in the kind of the UN thing. But just to tell you something about the US itself, where you're saying it's also your problem, let me tell you how much of a problem it is. From 2006 onwards, in this country, you spend more each year on bottled water than you do on iPods and movie tickets. Okay? Since 2006. That is the equation. You spend more on, and now bottled water, by the way, 1 liter of bottled water takes 1.75 liters of water through purification process. Coke takes 3 liters to 1 liter. Okay? So there's a cost to water everywhere, and the reason why Coke and Pepsi have gone so deep into the third world is because it would create outrage if they were looting that on that scale at home. The case that Shankar mentioned, Lachimada, began with a classic letter from an old agricultural a lady farmer, small marginal farmer, who wrote to the Prime Minister of India seeking permission, dear Prime Minister. It was brilliant sarcasm, just a few lines, one paragraph. It said, I'm seeking your permission, Prime Minister, to draw water from my own well. Because right now it's full of toxic sludge from the coke factory next door. So, I mean, you guys are out there too. You know, and the use of water in bottled water and in soft drinks has huge ratios of use, 3 liters to 1 or 1.75 to 1.
Thank you again so much for the panelists to bring up this very, very important question. So privatization clearly is not a solution, and companies are not. And I also caution us to think about whether the government can do anything, because it depends on the government. And I have two questions. One is in terms of thinking about the government. I've done a lot of work in China on the dry land where water is crucial, and the government is having these crazy policies to plant trees on dry land that's actually using water in a very ineffective way, and claim that we have the largest tree planting program in the world, bragging about it. And also, China has all these water diversion programs that are just not ecologically sound. And so the government is not helping in that sense. And so I wonder whether in India, I probably have more hope for India, because at least it claimed to have some mechanism of a democracy. Is India more hopeful? Indian government more hopeful? Is Indian government that bad as what we saw in the play, in terms of just not taking care of the people at all, not caring?
I have to say, with great shame and embarrassment, yes. It is that bad.
It can be worse.
It can be completely. It can be absolutely worse. I mean, the place is surreal, but it's very believable. I think it's very realistic.
It actually happens.
Yeah, the sort of the bureaucracy of it, right? This sort of displacement of trying to boycott. I mean, the bureaucracy where there's a great scene, and the film version of the play also did it in a really wonderful way. Where he says, such and such a person wrote a letter which went to this person, who wrote a letter which went to this person, and then the whole thing takes 5 years. So sometimes it's something as banal as the bureaucracy of it, right? It's not something as dramatic as, overt violence, but it does happen. So having said that, and really, yes, it is as bad. But India is also a place with a free press of a kind, increasingly corporatized. Sainath is cringing, and he's a journalist, so obviously he knows what he's talking about. But I would say Sainath himself is an example of this, what I mean to say is that, I hate to be hopeless, right? I mean, I don't want to be hopeless. And yes, things are as bad as that. But yes, it's also true that there is space for room for debate and pressure. And there are victories like Plachimara, like the very staging of this play. I mean, the part that the amazing thing, so city and country, the diversion of resources to the city is a real issue, right? But at the same time, audiences were moved by the play in cities and in villages. So it's not as if, people don't recognize that this is a problem and that they care about it, right? So I have a few editors in Delhi telling me this is so dated, but clearly when the play is staged, there is house full, people the newspapers are filled with it, because what an amazing play it is. So I don't want to be hopeless, so I think there is room and space for debate and discussion, though things are pretty bad as well.
Answering specifically the question on what governments are doing now, for instance. Actually, first thing, I think that India is a site for hope because it's a site of so many water conflicts and struggles. People are fighting. There are 1,000 battles where people are fighting against the takeover of their water, where communities are resisting corporations. As long as that is the case, I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. I think there's hope. What are governments actually doing? We live, and I think this is very important, in an era where governments are not just the handmaidens of, but are driven by corporations. Okay, now there's a state in India called Chhattisgarh. Around the same time that Uruguay passed a national referendum and constitutional amendment banning forever the privatization of water, the government of Chhattisgarh privatized a river. 23 kilometers of the Shionath River. Well, maybe they just got tired of selling people down the river. They thought, let's just sell the river. Now that is the kind of bureaucratic and corporate direction of water. The other is an incredibly insane plan, which is mentioned in passing, of interlinking 37 rivers across the country. Rivers that built their course over millions of years. Okay? And you're going to, without looking at the contours, the geophysical contours, nothing, you're going to try and link these rivers together. Civilizations came up along the banks of these rivers. You're going to divert you're going to try and out-engineer nature, which took millions of years for the job. So that's the kind of thinking at the government and policy level. Say a little way down is the corporates looking at what is the profit, how do we make a quicker buck on this, and on the ground are people, communities fighting to preserve their water and their water rights. So both things happen.
And I have to say, we think about what's happening in China and India, and Hawaii is not much better. We have great laws on the books, but again, on the ground and in the community, that's not respected or protected. And I think what's the most disappointing about that is that there was a specific effort by a handful of folks to, make water a public trust resource, not a private commodity, in large part in response to the plantations that had controlled water on almost all of the islands. So in 1978, there was a constitutional convention. People ran delegates, amended the Constitution. In 1987, after about a decade of negotiations, the water code was passed. Great, everybody thought, finally, Uncle Charlie and other folks helped write that. Finally, we've got some, the Water Commission is formed and they have their duty, they're going to do it. No. It took cases like Waihole that were filed in the 1990s, and people said, okay, well, finally we got this Supreme Court decision in 2000, all right, well, maybe the Water Commission was confused. Even though the writing was very clear, maybe they didn't understand what their duties were, but that still continues to happen today. In Navaeha and Maui, there's one corporation, practically, Alexander and Baldwin and its subsidiary, East Maui Irrigation and Hawaiian Commercial Sugar Company, that control between 200 and 300 million gallons of water every day, diverted from East Maui communities and from Navaeha. The principal source of drinking water for that island, the Iao Aquifer, is 20 million gallons per day. So obviously the companies are controlling much more resource-wise than the county, and the Water Commission has allowed that to happen. And that's been the status quo in some communities since the 1800s, and it's really been thanks to the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation and Earth Justice, who've represented a handful of groups who've been willing to stand up and fight for their water rights. That's the only way that we're seeing restorations in the streams and communities. And so I think the stories are very similar because on its face it looks frustrating, but it's really been the resilience of people and communities that have helped to bring justice and water to these communities.
I think another part of the problem, and this has to do with corporations and that whole thing as well, has to be the direction or the form that agriculture has taken, and the way agriculture uses water. And it's kind of interesting that I think, sugar plays a role in all of this in so many parts of the world. It's kind of astounding. I think the country that grows the second most sugarcane is India in the world right now. And that model that sugarcane follows. Sugarcane was basically, sugar and probably cotton were the first monocrops that really happened in agricultural history. And that monocrop, I mean, that's kind of what made Hawaii ethnographically what it is today. And then they figured out, that, so they needed wave after wave of immigrants to keep coming in and doing that work. And there were lots of reasons why they had different waves of immigrants. One is they wanted to pit people against each other, but the other is that no one wanted to stay in that kind of job for very long. They wanted out. And so eventually, agriculture changed so that allowed that to happen. So you only needed a fraction of the people that you ever needed before. And that's the whole technology that's associated with it, the creation of nitrogen fertilizer, which allowed us to go from it taking 14 hours to harvest 50 bushels off of corn or wheat off of 2 acres to, a couple hours to harvest that same amount of bushels off of that same 2 acres to today, where it's like 1 hour to harvest that amount of bushels off of 1 acre. So this monoculture allowed our whole civilization to get people off of the land, away from the land. But the costs, and it allowed, in one respect, this huge amount of cheap food to just flood the world. And so cheap food in forms that are not that great. As I think in India, half the population is malnourished and the other half is overweight. And in China, there's like 100 million people who are overweight now. So everybody knows about all of those issues. So that capacity to grow huge amounts of food and provide food cheaply, that totally changed agriculture. And we went to a mono-agriculture kind of a thing. But at the same time, we don't count all of the costs of that. And those costs, besides those nutritional costs, are the pollution that happens, the pesticides, the runoff into the ocean. All of those things are huge, and we don't add that in. So, to start to get at some of these problems, we need to relook at these different industries and say, do they actually make sense to do it this way? And what if we did it differently? Then what would our economy look like? And what would that do for our populations? And what effect would that have on population growth? So I think agriculture and how agriculture is done is a really important factor in this. I know it's a big deal in India.
So I was going to ask a question a while back, but one of the things corporations do that nobody talks about very much is that they tend to externalize their internal costs. And it always amazed me that the EPA have all these crazy regulations. It should be very simple. Clean water in, clean water out. And then if you can't do that, you're fined or put out of business. There's no reason that it would be any other way. Same thing with the air. This is a water thing, but the air in a way gets polluted more, You don't get to pump carbon dioxide into the air without a cost. And corporations don't pay. One of the craziest things we have going in America now with the fracking is that they flare off the natural gas. So instead of using it as a less polluting fuel as opposed to oil, they're just burning it and heating the air up and creating more carbon dioxide. And so I'm wondering, have any of you worked with that concept of, because, I don't know, I have bees on my roof and stuff, and I'm a vegetarian, I do things like that, but as far as, going out and changing the world, I'm not doing that. And so I'm wondering, how do we go get corporations to, no longer have the right to externalize their internal costs? Thank you. Thank you very much.
If I had the answer to that, I certainly wouldn't be here. I mean, that's an excellent point, and one that, in my work, in representing community groups that are seeking to restore their streams and communities or protect their natural and cultural resources, is increasingly frustrating because, and that's just my own cynical view, corporations, especially within the United States system, as an entity in and of themselves are allowed far more rights to pollute and to do many other things than, I would let them do if it was up to me. So it's incredibly frustrating in a number of different levels, and I don't know what the solution is to that.
No, I certainly don't know the solution to this, and probably Kapua, you know more about this than I do, because I'm just sort of clutching at something which I came across again as I was doing research for the Coca-Cola. But there is a kind of a nascent attempt in legal circles to insist on the origins of the corporation, which was a charter given by local communities, right? So corporations have evolved through various complicated processes very far away from that. But if you go back and look at legal history in the middle of the 19th century, as I understand it, in the United States, there is a particular moment where there is a specific relationship between the corporation and its community through a sort of kind of a chartering process. And maybe there is something about trying to bring that back and insist on, that corporations are not these almost abstract entities, right, which are so removed, and often they are based in one place and doing business halfway around the globe, and they become very legally sort of irresponsible in every sense of the term entities. And I think part of the struggle has to be to find ways to make them responsible again, and through specific kinds of understanding of the history of the corporation. And I see Laura Lyons sitting at the back, and so she too has done some work on this and may have something to say. But I think that's the kind of work which does need to be done, that really kind of demystify the corporation, understand it as a legal entity, and then go to the history of it as a way of countering what it is and saying, look, this is.
But unfortunately, I think the law is going in the opposite direction, where corporations are given more and more rights, especially within the United States, system, make donations, no problem, no limits, all those sorts of things. And I think one example here in Hawaii is on Kauai, where I'm from, there's been a huge effort to try to regulate GMOs at the county level. And one of the major, and even though the county charter on Kauai reserves to the county the ability to protect certain kinds of issues, including and regulate that with respect to things like health and safety, the council is attempting to do that, and the major pushback and the threats by the GMO corporations and all the attorneys that they've retained locally is that if that ordinance passes, they will sue because it somehow infringes upon their rights. So even where we see entities at the local level being really proactive and trying to better regulate in order to protect not just their natural and cultural resources, but their citizens, because, when things are polluted, and I'm sure they'll just dig out from Kauai, and it's going to be the people from that community like me that are going to be stuck trying to clean it up. But we'll have to see how that plays out here in Hawaii, because I think that's going to be a major issue.
I think the fundamentally great confrontation of our time will be the confrontation with corporate power. Whether it's in food security, that's why I said the two greatest crops, hunger and thirst. So there's no escaping that, to confront and tame corporate power. But both things are happening. On the one hand, if you look at it historically, epocally, there have been some advances in parts of the world over what corporations could get away with 100 years ago, 80 years ago. That's happened. On the other hand, there are huge setbacks. Now, giving personhood to corporations, recognizing corporations as persons, which the highest courts have gone and done. In fact, I remember Jim Hightower commenting on that, saying, I'll believe a corporation is a person when they execute one in Texas. And I think that's a good test. So you do have, I think the basic thing is, you are in an era where the dominance of corporate power is something that you haven't seen since they had to, break up the house of, Standard Oil into 7 little companies, or the 7 sisters, or whatever they called it, and break up a number of other monopolies. But the hopeful part is that, look, it happened once, and it happened even in the media once, when in the 40s you had a number of acts to break the monopolies over production and distribution in the media. Hollywood was affected by such laws. So you are capable of it. Your history shows you that we are all capable of changing that around and turning it around. But the corporations we face today are more powerful in different ways than those that the world has ever seen. So it's a huge battle. It has never been easy. It has been won. It won't be easy. It can be won.
I think there is a bit of a revolution. Maybe it's in this country more than any other, but the whole food issue, you know, at first I thought it was a fad, you know, this whole everybody talking about food and nutritional. I was thinking it was a fad and food security, but I don't feel that that's true anymore. I think slowly the issue of food security is getting more sophisticated and going after more and more issues. But the fact that everybody has to eat, just the sheer power of the education, you know, how many people can you reach? How many people can you get to change? And you know, the more that we can learn about stuff, the more that we can learn that the salt, sugar, and fat, that there's a deliberate attempt by the whole food industry to make sure that we stay addicted to that. You know, the more people learn about that kind of stuff, then maybe that's a revolution against corporations that everybody could get on board with, and it might spill over into how they think about other corporations that do other kinds of business. So I'm hopeful where that kind of thing happens. You know, maybe someone with a bunch of money could open up a McVegetables next to a McDonald's and serve the right kind of fast food, and at the same time educate people about the store that's going on next to them. Or, you know, with the technology that we have, there could be phone apps that tell you all kinds of stuff when you walk into a place, and, you know, you do the phone app and look at the food that you're about to buy coming from this company, and what's the history of it and what's going on there, you know. So I think that there's a lot of creative thinking that can happen there, and food is the vehicle.
I just want to say that, you know, I think in the play, corporations are never mentioned because, in a way, historically, the state was the issue, right? And I think the world has progressed in a different direction. And I'm an old-fashioned Marxist enough still to believe, a social democrat, let's say, to believe that I don't want to give up entirely on the state, right? I think the states should be, accountable to citizens. I think we should try to exercise our power through that. States are highly corrupted entities, but it may not be time to give up on them entirely. So if you're going to insist on right, then you have to ask the question, who do I claim that right from? And in a way, the state might be the best entity if we are able to sort of really, keep it honest, right? Corporations, not so much, right? I mean, corporations, I think, are evil, frankly, and not to put too fine a point on this. The question is just how do you regulate their power, right? The story of Plachimada, I think, is that you can use local, and this is the point I really wanted to come to, is that you can use local government processes, because the Coca-Cola plant in Plachimada was shut down when the local governing body revoked the license to the plant. They didn't have to go to the central government. They didn't have to go to the international court of anything. It was a local, sort of, along with lots of different kinds of pressures which were put on it. But, agitation at the local level was very effective in Plachimada as well. And so, that is something to keep in mind, that, there are these sort of, local governing sort of, bodies that can be.
In the Waihole water case, we used to have intense discussions. I mean, we kind of talked our way through that whole case. We would just talk to anybody and talk and talk and talk and talk. And even when we were going through the hearings, all of the people who are against us, the people who are working for these different large landowners and corporations, we would talk with them and talk with them and talk with them. And, it would start off with a conversation, oh, how's your son doing in soccer? And so we'd have that kind of conversation, then we'd get into the argument and never let up on that argument. But the problem always was, if you followed that yellow brick road of the corporation, there was no wizard at the end who was making any kind of decision. This was just some amorphous entity, and these guys were working for this amorphous entity, and they go, what can I do, So in some ways, the corporations, there's a sense in which they don't even exist, if you know what I mean, if you're looking for somebody to hold personally responsible. But then on the other hand, going back to Coca-Cola again, I heard that there was like one of the top executives of Coca-Cola, they were going to move into Brazil and start doing a heavy marketing campaign in Brazil amongst all of the youth. And this guy's wife told him, do you really want to do that? And he actually quit Coca-Cola and went to work for some cheese company in California or something like that. So there are, that kind of educational effort does, it's very slow and very small, but goes one by one. And there is a 10% rule, which is if you convince 10% of the people of anything, it's a done deal. And so it's not like we have to convince 50% of the population to get something changed. It's way, way smaller than that. And that was kind of proved in the nuclear disarmament time, when the Physicians for Social Responsibility started this organization with the doctors in Russia, basically saying we don't prepare for a nuclear war, that's not possible. And so they started this organization, and it was very interesting that they finally reached success and disarmament started to happen when the number of doctors in the United States, the percentage of doctors in the United States who belong to Physicians for Social Responsibility reached 10%. And then it was like everybody went, well, of course you can't survive a nuclear war. Then it was like a done deal. So I think that's the hopeful side that I look at.
I'm going to actually take a few questions at once and then let you guys answer them, just because I see a number of hands up, and that will allow more questions on the floor. So I'm going to.
My question today is that it is predicted that the next wars are going to be about water, and this is already sort of happening in my state, and I think the split of my state into Telangana is also largely because of socio-political issues, but also because of unequal distribution of resources, especially water. So my question specifically is, do you think there is an urgent need to rethink water sharing mechanisms between communities, states and countries, and what would you propose?
Aloha. My question to you is, with all this GMO and pesticides that are being sprayed here, and Hawaii being the #1 GMO seed exporter in the world, and basically we're sitting on top of our water, which is being capped off. So all these pesticides that are going into our water, they had a lady from MIT that basically says, and she studied this thoroughly, that it's going to be 1 in 2 children that are going to have autism with what they're using in the pesticides. Now, how come none of this is coming out and it's not waking up people? Mahalo.
I'm just going to have 2 more on the floor, and then we'll let people answer them.
Well, I guess we've hinted at this before, but it seems like these, with all the neoliberalism politics, everything's designed to be globalized and to neuter the autonomy of individual countries. And these trade agreements seem to be trying to rush through all this legislation that will supersede any banning of these things. And so I think, again, the corporations are international. It's like an international imperialistic thing, and they just feel like they have to ramrod these things through. A lot of times the legislators haven't even read them. They're handed to them, and then they try to, like the Patriot Act, it's just there, okay, pass it, we have to pass it. So it's, I think, a huge problem when you can pass these regional laws that says you can't do this, but if you get sued by this corporation because it's against the Pacific Trade Pact or the Atlantic Trade Pact or this or that, these are huge draconian corporate powers that are emasculating individual sovereignty. And do you have anything to say about that?
Okay, one last one, and then we'll just hope that you can keep. We can actually. Oh, she was next. We can put two more on the floor, I guess.
Hi. I'm glad I'm hearing all of this about, like what I think was like a reference to TPP that's coming up and all these things that are emasculating individual sovereignty and the importance of discussion and how things happened in the past that you mentioned about discussion, talking with anybody and everybody about what we need to talk about. I mean, the current fad that you thought was a fad that didn't go away, it didn't happen by itself. It happened because, people did not give up and they kept talking about it, whether they talked about it in open, where they might lose their job, or whether they talked about it within specific communities. And I think someone had kind of like a what next kind of question over there. I think I wanted to bring up the importance of discussion, education, and nurturing a huge community base of knowledge. And so I guess my question specifically has to do with what is happening in Hawaii right now. Who has the straws that are not being straws directly into the water table that are not being monitored, and I know that I've been told that there are quite a few, and so we need to know about those.
Why don't you guys, before your brains get completely overloaded, answer which of those you want, and then I know that you had your hand up as well.
I'm going to, a couple of those questions I'm not equipped to answer, like the one, what's going on in Hawaii. And I'm going to collapse all the other questions because, frankly, I don't quite remember in this, and say that the key thing here, because all of the what do we do, is the key thing is not to be so overwhelmed that you're paralyzed. I think is key. It's true that these systems are huge, they're global, there are these treaties, these free trade agreements, and these corporations are multinational, they're transnational, they're all over the place. One of the issues with Coca-Cola has always been, how do you bring it to account for some of its human rights abuses in Central America or elsewhere when it's, sitting inside the United States, right? And so there have always been these issues. But that's the reason why I think we also should break it down into smaller pieces which are tackleable, right? And to think about ways in which we can use local governing bodies, which we may be able to control in getting certain kinds of results, which may not be possible. It's not that we give up those other arenas of struggle. I think we do need to target them as well, but it's not always to be thinking that that's where you have to win, but there may be things that we can do locally by things like revocation of licenses, like things like making, incredible sort of public opinion pressure to be brought upon particular sort of entities in local situations. I think that is the way to feel not to feel disempowered, right? Some of us may have access to these much, larger, arenas and be able to effectively speak there. But I think all of us will also have access at local levels and to be able to use that in ways in which we can, do something. And I don't believe that sometimes this is a chain of relationships, and you put enough pressure on one chain, the consequences are felt everywhere up and down on that chain. So that's what I would say in my answer to collectively the question.
And I think to build on Shankar's response, I mean, some of the local issues, like the question with respect to GMOs and the concern about long-term health impacts, there's been a lot of studies that have already been done locating atrazine and different chemicals in different areas, and yet when the ordinance that came up on Kauai at the county level, the GMO companies flew in, I don't even know how many experts, tons of experts, to assure the government officials that there would be no impact. And I think that links to the question on education and the importance of getting information out to the community. I think one of the things that we did in Waiahole, in Navaiahan, a lot of these other water struggles was use Olelo and other educational media. Now with social media, we have tremendous opportunity to be able to get information out there. And I think that's one of the most important ways that we can, as communities, kind of respond to the half-truths that are being put forward. And that can be done really effectively in lots of different ways, with Instagram, with Twitter, with Facebook, with tons of different things. And so I think, and I also think it's most powerful when it's done on an individual community level, because there was a question about, well, who has the straws in the water? It depends. It's different in every community. On Maui, most of those straws are held by, Alexander and Baldwin, East Maui Irrigation. I think in general on the different islands, you see remnants of the plantation systems that used to own, the entities that used to own those lands have now spun off these different limited liability corporations. But in other communities, we're seeing in the Big Island on Molokai, Lanai, huge chunks of land or even whole islands being sold off to individuals. And so really I think on a community level we need to make that examination, and we need to be more accountable. People don't think about it. Living in a place like Hawaii, we're so blessed. You turn on the water and it's safe, you can drink it. You flush the toilet or you turn off the sink and that water goes somewhere. Most people don't even think about where water comes from or where it goes after it leaves your house. And that's something on an individual level that we can all be more accountable for.
I take your point about the sense of being overwhelmed. You're talking about giant entities. Yet, here's the curious thing. In the most successful struggles and the most successful actions, the curious thing is the great battles against what we call globalization, which word I never use. Capitalism is good enough for me. The great struggles against globalization have been intensely local. It's about the shutting down of the school in your neighborhood, the selling off of the waterworks in your colony, the closure of the factory and the loss of the jobs in your neck of the woods. Marrying the energy of these local struggles is the huge challenge. But there are millions of them on, and they're on in a system which I sincerely believe, and that they try hard to prove to us that it is unraveling. Since 2008, you've seen that. Who thought 10 years ago that millions of people would be pounding the streets of Greece, Spain, and Portugal? Yeah? Who thought 10 years ago that you would see Occupy Wall Street and it's being emulated by 400 towns in the US? Some of these will fail, some of them will succeed, but they were local energies. They were very local. Now, from there, yes, the challenge is then how to scale it, how to get up. But the fact is that those local battles have proved extremely important, and they are the starting point. I just want to plug into the other questions via 2 points that Charlie made, which I agree with. One is about rethinking in terms of rethinking agriculture and the kinds of industrial agriculture and the kinds of water use that presently go on in that. Also on the point of food that he made, the stats actually support what you're saying. If you look at it, the growth rate of sales from co-ops has been much higher in the United States than those of the supermarkets of food items. When I first came to the United States in 1984, I visited your farmers market in Union Square in New York. There were about a dozen farmers from upstate New York and Connecticut. Today, you can't get into the place. It's now twice a week. You can't get into the place. They've opened a second farmers market next to the UN building, and it looks like a giant rally on Palestine or something like that. So that change, I mean, that's a very hopeful sign about the kind of things. In fact, corporations are so worried about it that they have to try and usurp and take over, like they have tried to, in my opinion, successfully to an extent, to take over what is called organic. Corporations now dominate much of output of what is called, because they can go to the legislature and define organic the way they want. I believe one day the United States will be the first nation to market organic nuclear waste, and India will be the first buyer. So it's also a battle over the terms of what is a human right, what is agriculture, what are the rights of living beings. And yes, I think that, I think he's right about the state being used, but remember, it gets used both ways. So that's also the struggle in the local governance. We've seen in India many local struggles having their outcomes crushed by the state by resorting to, and the corporations going to the courts to bankrupt those struggles with a thing. But there was a very, very great, probably the greatest Indian human rights person ever, who also drafted our constitution, who said, educate, organize, agitate. I think that's a beautiful formula.
I think I really believe in that too, but I want to add a little bit about the agitate part of it. I have this, I've had for, 30 some years, this picture of Gandhi in my bathroom. So every time I go down to the bathroom, I sit there and I look at Gandhi. And then on the wall, we have a bunch of bumper stickers on the door. So I'm sitting here looking at the bumper stickers that are on the door of the bathroom. And one of them is from Gandhi, which is, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And so I've always really believed in his ability to change things through nonviolent action. And I know that when I read about him is he drove, like he went to Britain at one point and sat down with all these British leaders and stuff, and he drove them crazy because they could not make him mad. No matter what they said, they couldn't make him mad. They weren't changing his mind, but it kind of blew their minds. And I kind of feel like that's the kind of model we need to go back to, standing on the streets and shouting and waving your fists, that to me, that doesn't work. That's just following the same model that they're using against everybody anyway. We're just doing the exact same thing. So I think we could get way more creative with agitation. I mean, this play is agitation. What if we did a lot more plays? What if we did like the San Francisco, they used to have this theater way back in the 60s, I think, right? And they would perform impromptu on the street in various places. What if we went back doing stuff like that? Now there's like the spoken word thing, right? That's this, kids are just adopting this like crazy, and there's all kinds of stuff going on now. What if we went to that? Or like Makana did that music protest thing where he just sang the same verse over and over and over and over again, I thought that was pretty cool. So I think we can get way more creative in the ways that we agitate. And people remember that kind of stuff way more than somebody standing there shouting out their position and waving their fist. They might not remember that, but if somebody sings a song or stands on their head and does something, that's going to be what they remember, and then they'll remember that message and they'll go for that. That's my perspective on that agitate part.
I didn't know Uncle Charlie was going to promote the English department for us tonight, but thank you. We have one more question. Does anybody else have, we could bundle two, otherwise we'll just have one more. Okay, so these two questions, and also somebody asked that I mention Flow as something to watch, and also if anybody has information about October 12th, raise your hand now. Okay.
Well, picking up on that,
I would like to know if any of you know what's happening on October 12th here. I was with the crowd estimated as large as 2,500 on May 25th that marched through Waikiki, 2,500 people taking up 2 lanes of Kalakaua Avenue. So supposedly on October 12th there's to be another kind of action against Monsanto, but what happened on Kauai with 4,000 people, it's estimated this is a great example of what we can do, what we need to do. We need to be out there. We need to be shown with our signs and our passion. Thank you.
Where's our last person? Okay, so this will be our last question, and I'm also just going to ask ahead of time that once we conclude the panel, if you guys don't mind helping with chairs, we will be very grateful.
Aloha. I wanted to just mention what this gentleman here was talking about. In Mapunapuna, not very, just down the street from Olelo, there is a Coca-Cola bottling plant. And I used to have to wait for the bus right there, so I know. And you can smell the caramel cooking in the air. But I know that they're not bringing water in trucks. And I know that they must be using water from the local aquifer, which is either Salt Lake or Mauna Lua. So I was just wanted to mention that I'm wondering where that water is actually coming from. And one of the products that they sell is actually water. Daisante is one of their products, and I'm wondering if that's just Hawaiian water, just filtered, and which is what a lot of companies here do. So that's my concern about water. And I'm also wondering about how much they're possibly paying, because over here it seems like the more water that you use, the less you pay, kind of thing. It's kind of very strange, but that's my impression of the water thing here. So any thoughts on that?
Very briefly, I don't know about the Coca-Cola plant here, but Coca-Cola's history going back to the late 19th century is a pretty checkered one, let's say, because its racial politics are really complicated, and was involved in the sale of Coke was involved in sort of race riots in the early 20th century because quote unquote Negroes were like drinking Coke and getting all sort of hopped up on it. The thing about fighting the corporation is that it's not as if Coca-Cola is the worst corporation in the world, right? Because there may be, Pepsi-Cola is as bad, right? So the point about it is to understand also symbolic politics, right? And to use it in the right way. So I think it's a mistake to just sort of focus on one or two corporations, even if we do focus on it in strategic ways. So that's basically what I would say, is that really, is to understand that the different ways to fight corporate power, and not to make the mistake of thinking that once you sort of vanquish Coca-Cola, if that were possible, that's the main goal. I think we really are sort of fighting corporate power. We're not fighting individual corporations. We are doing that, certainly, and in the local sort of struggles we may be doing that, but it's also this idea of unbridled corporate power. That seems to be manageable, rather than saying let's abolish corporations. To think that we should find ways to fetter and stop and control the unbridled corporate power is I think conceivable, and I like that,
So build this giant Coca-Cola, Pepsi, whatever statue out of the cans, a very obese statue, and then animate it and do a whole hip hop routine with it and put it on YouTube and see how many hits you get.
So there are lots of bottling companies actually, water bottling companies that operate in Hawaii. There was a case recently on Kauai having to do with the Kauai Springs case, where the Kauai Planning Commission actually denied Kauai Springs, which was bottling 5-gallon bottles of water from a spring, Kahili mountainside, and selling it. And the Planning Commission actually revoked their permit based largely on the public trust. And the corporation sued. They went to circuit court, and the judge agreed with the corporation, went up to the Intermediate Court of Appeals here in Hawaii, which said, well, no, not necessarily. We can regulate this because of the public trust. And it's now on appeal before the Hawaii Supreme Court. So there's going to be an argument on that in November. And just to answer the question with respect to the tiered water rates, in Hawaii, although ag, in some senses, it gets cheaper depending on how much you use. In Hawaii, for most of the municipal water systems and for the city and county of Honolulu, the more you use, the more expensive it gets. So that it's supposed to encourage you to conserve. But, you know, that depends a lot on the individual.
Okay, any final thoughts, or if not, let's give a hand to the panelists.